Every week, millions of Americans go to church. Hundreds of millions, actually. Most of them go on Sunday mornings, as we do. Others, including some Christian sects, have their primary religious services on Saturdays or Friday evenings. And a smaller number, but still in the millions, go to church or other religious services 2 or more times a week. Week after week, year-round, this happens. It is the basis for describing America as one of the most religious societies in the Western world. Mr. Gallup, the Pew Trust, and other pollsters keep track of the trends, how certain kinds of churches are growing and others are declining, and how the religious landscape is shifting. Currently, much is being made about a decline in overall attendance and affiliation, and the increase among younger people in particular to classify themselves among what has come to be called the nuns. That's N-O-N-E-S, not nuns as in habits and cloisters. But if you ignore the publicity and look at the overall numbers, they do not change much. Church attendance, of course, is a very inexact science. I used to say that most ministers have double vision. They see their congregations as twice as large as they are. But while some religious varieties are in decline, others are growing. And over time, there is always shifting. According to some sources in recent years, Islam is now statistically the fastest growing religion in America, though others say that Pentecostalism is, and there's probably nothing more different than Islam and Pentecostalism. Still others would say that the real story in religious ferment over several years is an ongoing increase of quasi-religious groups. Everything from AA and other 12-step groups to S-training to informal house gatherings for prayer and Bible study, which are mostly characterized by their non-institutional structure, but which are all clearly responding to some spiritual need. Some sociologists even describe what is going on as another great awakening, such as happened in America in the late 17th century and again in the 18th. Religious books, most of which are not counted in newspaper bestseller lists, constitute nonetheless a substantial portion of the total book market, with various presses and bookstores devoted solely to religion. And so far as I know, the Bible, in all its various translations with new translations still being written, still outsells everything else, notwithstanding the fact that virtually every household in America already has at least one. Especially if you're in the business, as I have been for more than 40 years now, none of this is exactly news. In fact, religion is such a pervasive element of American life that it tends to be taken for granted. Here is a statistic that has stuck with me from somewhere. Every week, more Americans go to worship services than the number of people who attend all the professional sports events in this country in an entire year. Now contrast this with the attention paid to religion compared with the coverage of sports and politics. With occasional aberrations like the visit of a pope, which doesn't happen too often, and clergy sex scandals that do, religion rarely makes the front page. This hasn't always been true. One of the things I learned some years ago when I was doing a lot of historical research is that in the 19th century and even before, newspapers used to routinely carry in their Monday editions reports on sermons preached in the various pulpits, some on the front page, and commonly entire sermons were reproduced. They didn't have much to do in those days, I guess. Now, of course, except in the Southeast, religion gets regulated to a page or less, largely unread, I suspect, in the Saturday editions of most papers. Meanwhile, of course, sports gets a big section all to itself every day. The difference can perhaps also be explained with a sports metaphor. Taken as a whole, like sports, religion is big business. The majority of the billions of charitable dollars Americans contribute each year goes to religious institutions. But the problem for religion is there are too many franchises. The vast majority of the congregations of all denominations are small, fewer than 100 members, and many much smaller than that. And most of what used to be considered the major franchises, or let's say the big leagues, like the Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Lutherans, and others, as they used to be called mainline Protestant groups, have been losing market share, money, and members for almost a half century now, yielding to a huge and bewildering proliferation of other options. The mainline Protestant churches peaked in membership right around 1968, as incidentally, so did our denomination. So, like American society in general, religion is increasingly pluralistic. There is also, I believe, some elitism in the way religion gets reported. The best educated Americans, including those who shape public opinion and write about it, either belong to no church at all or retain a nominal affiliation with what are still considered the major denominations, those which are mainly white and upper middle class. But the growth in religion over the past 30 years has happened elsewhere in social terms. Within Christianity, most of the growth has been among the conservative, evangelical, Pentecostal, and fundamentalist churches. But most people I know would be hard-pressed even to define the differences among those three terms. And excepting Utah and its bordering states, most Americans know little about Mormonism, still growing rapidly worldwide, though less so here in this country recently. Also Islam, to which could be added Eastern religions, especially Buddhism, which are an increasing part of the American religious pie. I guess that's shifting the metaphor a little bit. Religiously speaking, this is a very different country than the one I grew up in, and many of you grew up in, and I think that few of us are fully conscious of just how different it is. We take a lot for granted in this aspect of our lives. Certainly we take for granted how remarkable it is to have created a society in which this huge degree of religious pluralism has been so far sustained for the most part without the kind of factionalism which has seeded violent hatred and bloodshed in so many parts of the world, a phenomenon which, if anything, is increasing. Religious tolerance, of course, has long been one of the defining tenets of our liberal faith, and we are fortunate to live in a country where this is more the norm than the exception. But we cannot afford to take it for granted. Nothing human is ever finally or permanently achieved. In the past 2 or 3 decades, one of the most interesting things that has happened, at least in my opinion, is that the American Unitarian Universalists have renewed their relationship with the oldest Unitarian churches in the world in Transylvania by establishing congregation-to-congregation partnerships. These churches date from the 16th century, 1568 to be precise, and their history is largely one of struggle and suffering. Long ago, it was costly to be a Unitarian there, but even in the 20th century, these days, as a triple these days, they are victims, I guess you could say, as a triple minority in Romania in terms of ethnicity and language, in addition to faith, religion. Within living memory, Unitarians in that part of Romania have risked and even sacrificed their lives for what they believed, especially during the communist period, which began right after the Second World War and ended with the death of the last dictator, terrible man, Ceausescu, who had already managed to destroy one village and its Unitarian building. This is a long story, and I can't go, it would take too long to talk about the history, but we now have relationships, and people are going back and forth, and it's enriched, I think, both sides of the partnership. But to know this relatively recent history is to have an enlarged perspective on the precious value of the central principles of our free faith, and to know that we cannot afford to take them for granted. On a lighter note, at a conference I attended in Berkeley, California some years ago, Robert Fulghum, everybody know Robert Fulghum? Yeah, whom I like to call Captain Kindergarten, told a story about his first year as a Unitarian minister in the Seattle area, a story I've never forgotten. Fresh out of Star King's School for the Ministry in Berkeley, which we both attended, over the first few months in his new parish, he told about working assiduously to compose sermonic masterpieces week after week, single-spaced on his manual typewriter, and of his disappointment as people would tell him the various reasons they had missed church. Too tired, too busy, off skiing, traveling for the weekend, family. So one Sunday, he actually did what many ministers, I suspect, only fantasize about. He went in very early one Sunday morning and posted a notice on the door of the church saying that services were canceled and listing all the reasons why. Too tired, too busy, off skiing, etc., etc. And that afternoon, he looked out the front window of his home to see his entire board of trustees gathered and walking up his sidewalk. Now, his voice broke, actually, as he told the next part of the story, because he said they had come not to chastise, but to comfort and be with their inexperienced, idealistic, and frustrated pastor. With understanding and compassion for what he was feeling, for what had led him to his pretty outrageous act. They ate chocolate chip cookies and drank coffee and talked. Now, if I hadn't gotten to know Fulghum as well as I have, I would suspect he was making this all up. But it was clear he was not. This really happened. He wanted them to take his calling as seriously as he did. He wanted them to take church as seriously as he did, to be there together in that unique hour of the week, set aside for worship, for church. I hope you remember the line in Philip Larkin's poem, "A serious house on serious earth it is." I would say they did have church that day, that group of folks. I doubt any of them have forgotten it. They ministered to him, but he too had done an unusual act of ministry, putting himself in a place of risk and vulnerability, though I doubt he was completely conscious of that fact. Of course, they might have responded very differently with anger or blame, but they did not. They let him know they were with him, really with him. And I like to think that they all learned something that day about themselves, about what church meant to them and to others, about what they had and could have, about what they took for granted, and about humanness. They also demonstrated a quality of what real church at its best can be, a place where we can express our need and have it heard, where we can fail and be forgiven. And all that is what church is for. In all its varied manifestations, in all its varied forms, with all its varied theology, with all its differing rituals and practices, its styles and forms, it comes down to something intimate and essential and simply human. People meeting and encountering one another at the deeper levels of life, those places where we are all most vulnerable and most fragile and most likely to be hurt, and where we know we can be heard and forgiven and go on. There are all kinds of times and places in life where this kind of meeting, real meeting, happens. But mostly they happen casually, haphazardly, now and then, unbidden, unplanned. But people come to church, I think, looking for that kind of meeting with others, and equally, perhaps even more, with themselves. Almost every Sunday that I preach, while I prepare and when I look out at the faces before the service begins, I contemplate what is going on in the hearts and minds of those gathered, what they bring with them. I imagine what might be going on in your lives, the ordinary joys and pain of life. I may know only a little, but in realizing how much I don't know, I realize the weight of it all and the importance of it all. At some level, I think we all do. We bring it all here, week after week. We bring it all here and lift it up and let it be. Some of it we share freely, openly with others. Much of it we keep hidden, sometimes even from ourselves. The church is many things, of course. It is partly a social club, partly a social service enterprise, partly a playground, partly a business, partly an educational institution, partly an arts guild, and much else besides. But at its heart is its spiritual mission, the kind of humanness and deeper human meeting that it calls us to, which is primarily expressed in the activity of worship, the hour when the church is most fully itself in its unique function. It is a time when we can be, in the deepest sense, alone, but alone together. It is a time to reflect on those things which we tend to take for granted, a time to set aside the distractions of life that protect us so well from the pain of looking deeply into ourselves and considering what we are making of this precious time, this short time of life, to realize that it is all fragile and fleeting, and to seek its meaning. In other words, the church is for both finding and realizing our faith, which is not words we say, but what we actually live by. We got time for a story. We got time for a story, right? There is a story of a photographer, I like to think it was a Unitarian photographer, who was out by himself taking pictures at a scenic mountain overlook, and as he stepped back and back to get just the right angle, took one step too many and fell off the cliff. In desperation, as he fell, he grabbed for the branch of a small tree that was growing out of the side of the cliff and held on for dear life. He dangled there for a few seconds, getting his breath, then called out, "Is anybody up there? Help! Is anyone up there?" He kept calling for a long time, "Is anybody up there?" And finally, a low, deep responded from seemingly nowhere, "I am here. Can I help you?" "You sure can," the man said. "Get a rope and get me out of here." "If you have faith," the voice said, "I can save you." "Do you have faith?" "Yes, I've got faith," the man called back, "but hurry up before I fall." "If you have faith," the voice said, "do as I say and everything will be all right. Just let go of that tree, the tree you're holding on to, and everything will be fine." And after a brief silence, the man cried out, "Is there anyone else up there?" This is a story about faith. and reminds me of something I heard in a sermon once, I think from Frederick Buechner. If you had to bet your life, what would you bet it on? We all of us bet, he said. And it's our lives themselves we're betting with, in the sense that betting is what shapes our lives. Not so dramatically, of course, as the man on the cliff. But we all live as if certain things were true or not true, even though we have no way of knowing for sure. And that is what faith is, where it comes in. It's not what we say, but what we live by. Not what we profess to believe, but the things we do deeply believe. And these are revealed in the lives we are actually living, the choices we make, the goals we pursue. These are the indications of what we are living for and why, our faith. To contemplate and realize all these things is what church is for. Looking at our life from the highest perspective, considering the bets we have made and are making. We don't come to church to get religion, but to be reminded. To remember, which is, if you put the space there, remember, reconnect, to put together the pieces of our broken lives. Sometimes, occasionally, something much more than that happens. Sometimes something magical, mysterious, different happens. We are most alive in those moments whenever and wherever they occur, in church or anywhere. But they are no more likely in one place than another. Worship is a time regularly set apart to recollect them. Recollect, reconnect, remember. And worship is an outward sign and symbol for that which is mainly deep and inner. What we do not signify and symbolize, we can lose touch with. And worship is like any other symbol. It is not the thing itself and should not be confused with it. Worship is not religion. It is not even necessarily a transcendent experience. In fact, usually it is not. But it is a window, an opening to these things. Joseph Campbell uses this marvelous phrase to describe a symbol. It is, he says, something transparent to transcendence. Transparent to transcendence. At its best, worship becomes that. It opens a window for us. And worship is shared experience. It is to receive the silent ministry of one another's presence. It is to take part in a community, not only of this present hour, but all the hours which preceded it and will come after. A community, as I like to say, of memory and hope and reverence. Others have sat and stood just in the place we do now, with doubts and perplexities, joys and sorrows, hopes and dreams similar to our own. Others will come to fill our place in the future. No life can have meaning solely unto itself. None of us lives just to ourselves or dies just to ourselves. Our lives take up meaning as they are bound up and intertwined with other lives. And our faith, too. It is not ours if it is ours alone. Worship is that time when the faiths which sustain us separately come to be renewed in the strength of other faiths, even those which may differ from our own. Beliefs can divide, but worship unites us in consciousness of our own common needs and aspirations. To borrow a well-known line from a dear and departed friend and colleague, in worship we share the mystery and the miracle of being alive and having to die. Worship is the center of any church, but I believe it has a special significance in our free churches. The free church, which accepts and welcomes differences of opinion and belief, has a special need to affirm worship as its center, for it is through worship that the essential character of the church, its unity in diversity, can be expressed. All kinds of divisions and differences can exist within a context which affirms the larger continuities and connections which make us whole. Two sentences more. The church is for remembering what we cannot afford to take for granted. We cannot afford to take it for granted either. Amen.